Rebecca Knight's rise to prominence was nothing short of meteoric. A young woman with a powerful voice and a fierce passion for social justice, she became a sensation in the world of online activism. She was the voice of inclusivity, a symbol of progressive values, and the figurehead of a digital movement that fought for equality, the rights of minorities, and the dismantling of systemic oppression. From humble beginnings, Rebecca built a platform that would eventually reach millions, turning her into a household name among activists and allies alike. Her journey began in the early days of social media, when she started sharing her thoughts on equality and social issues through personal blog posts and Twitter threads. At first, she had a modest following, just a few hundred supporters who appreciated her candid approach to tackling racism, sexism, and LGBTQ+ rights. However, as she delved deeper into the complex and often controversial world of social justice, her voice began to resonate with a larger, more diverse audience. Rebecca's posts were a blend of fiery commentary, educational resources, and personal stories that underscored the struggles faced by marginalized groups. She became known for her no-holds-barred approach to discussing inequality, consistently calling out people, organizations, and even institutions that perpetuated discrimination. Whether through well-researched blog posts, thought-provoking videos, or live streams filled with impassioned rants, she used every platform at her disposal to advocate for change. Her message was simple but compelling. Inclusivity wasn't just a nice idea, it was a necessity. Her content was a reflection of the times, raw, unapologetic, and often incendiary. She highlighted the realities of systemic racism, the wage gaps between men and women, the struggles of the LGBTQ+ community, and the violence faced by marginalized individuals. She called out the hypocrisy of celebrities who claimed to support these causes but were silent when it came to real-world action. Her blog posts delved into the nuances of intersectionality, while her social media campaigns urged her followers to engage in activism beyond the screens. Rebecca's social media presence was an extension of her online persona. Every post, tweet, and live stream was a declaration of her commitment to social justice. Her followers, who numbered in the millions, were as devoted to her as they were to the causes she championed. She didn't just have fans, she had a community, one that was deeply invested in her message and eager to take action. Her platform provided a space for people to come together, share their experiences, and support each other in their fights for justice. In many ways, Rebecca had become the modern-day face of activism, a symbol of a new generation of voices determined to make change. But with this success came responsibility. As her influence grew, so did the pressure. Rebecca was no longer just a blogger or a social media influencer, she had become an authority in the social justice sphere. People looked to her for guidance, for answers, and for validation. She was a trailblazer in the fight for equality, a champion of marginalized voices. The stakes were high, and Rebecca knew it. She had made a name for herself by calling out the injustice around her, but as her platform expanded, so too did the scrutiny on her actions. Would she be able to live up to the ideals she so passionately preached? Or would the weight of her influence reveal the cracks in her own practices? Rebecca Knight's story had only just begun, but in the ever-evolving world of online activism, the question remained, could she maintain the authenticity of her message, or would she fall victim to the very forces she sought to expose? Rebecca Knight had always been the unflappable voice of social justice in the digital age. Through her blog and social media platforms, she had amassed a devoted following. Her posts, filled with fiery calls for equality, racial justice, and gender inclusivity, struck a chord with millions. But her influence came at a price. As her fame grew, so did the scrutiny of her actions, and, slowly, cracks began to form in the image she'd so carefully constructed. The first challenge came unexpectedly. Javi Ortega, an Afro-Latinx queer activist, posted a tweet that stopped Rebecca in her tracks. "You preach inclusivity, Rebecca, but you silence those who challenge you," Javi wrote. "You block minorities who dare question your perfect narrative. When will you practice what you preach? When will you listen?" The words were like a slap in the face. Javi was not a random troll, he was someone who had supported her platform for years. But his tweet wasn't a mere criticism, it was an accusation that Rebecca was failing at the one thing she claimed to champion, inclusivity. She had blocked dissenting voices too many times, and now, Javi was calling her out. Rebecca's fingers hovered over her keyboard as she read the tweet again. She felt the familiar sting of defensiveness. How dare Javi question her commitment? She had done more for this cause than most people even knew. She quickly typed a response. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I've been fighting this fight for years, and if you don't see that, maybe you need to step back and look at your own actions. But Javi's words resonated deeper than she cared to admit. His post spread quickly, with others joining in, accusing Rebecca of hypocrisy. They reminded her that inclusivity wasn't just about agreeing with people who supported her, but about engaging with those who challenged her, even when it was uncomfortable. The backlash was swift. Followers began calling her out for blocking people who disagreed with her, especially those from marginalized communities. The once celebratory space Rebecca had created was now filled with tension. Supporters she had trusted began to question whether she was truly the ally she claimed to be. Rebecca sat frozen, staring at her phone, her mind racing. Every notification that popped up seemed like another indictment of her authenticity. She had spent so long crafting an image of herself as the leading voice of progressive change, but now the cracks were exposed. She couldn't just block the criticism away, no matter how much she wanted to. This wasn't just a small backlash, it was the beginning of a fracture that could destroy everything she had built. The questions kept coming, from people who had once been her fiercest supporters. Why block us? Why silence the voices of the very people you claim to support? Rebecca's defensiveness shifted to doubt. Could she continue this fight? Was she truly practicing what she preached, or was she just another influencer using the language of progressivism to maintain her position? The weight of the question lingered in the air as the tension in her community continued to rise. As the criticism continued to pour in, Rebecca found herself retreating further into her own bubble, one built on the very platform she had created to champion justice. Her mind raced with justifications. She couldn't afford to let her platform be overtaken by people who didn't understand her struggle. After all, wasn't she fighting the same fight as they were? Why couldn't they see that? Every day, her messages were being twisted into something they weren't, and it felt like she was being forced to defend her credibility rather than her causes. The act of silencing people, once a rare necessity, became her go-to response. She blocked users who posted critical comments, muted notifications from those who dared to challenge her narrative, and shut down anyone who seemed like they wanted to hold her accountable. The phrase "protecting my platform" ran through her mind like a mantra. But the more she silenced dissent, the more the doubts crept in. Was this really protecting her platform, or was she simply avoiding the uncomfortable truths people were pointing out? She tried to push the questions away, but they lingered. Blocking, muting, and cutting off connections felt safer. It allowed her to control the narrative, but the feeling of satisfaction it once gave her was now replaced with anxiety. Each time she hit block, it was as if she was shoving her own conscience into a drawer and locking it. As the days passed, the frustration from her critics grew louder. What had started with Javi's tweet spread to entire threads of people calling her out. Some had once been her supporters, others were voices she had ignored for too long. It's easy to preach inclusivity when there's no cost, isn't it, Rebecca? One user posted. You've blocked us because we ask you to walk your talk. You want to be the face of equality, but you only care about it when it's convenient for you. Rebecca scrolled through the comments, her hands trembling. One by one, her critics made their point. Her actions were self-serving. Her voice wasn't as empowering as it seemed. It was only empowering when it suited her image. It was a bitter pill to swallow. She had once believed she was a part of something larger, this movement for justice. But now, the walls were closing in. Those who had admired her were now calling her a fraud. Their accusations stung because they had a ring of truth to them. You preach intersectionality but block anyone who speaks out from that very community, another comment read. What does that say about your commitment? Or is this just your brand? Rebecca's stomach twisted. She had prided herself on being a bridge builder, a voice that could be trusted. But now, it was becoming evident that her public persona was being contrasted sharply against her private actions. The disconnect was so stark that it was impossible to ignore. She glanced at the messages once more, but the words felt like daggers in her chest. She had once been so confident in her position, sure of her moral high ground. But now, every post, every tweet, felt like an echo, a reminder that her actions didn't match her words. It wasn't just about political correctness anymore. It was about integrity. The frustration wasn't limited to the people she blocked, it was from the very community she had sworn to amplify. They had felt betrayed by her. How could she claim to fight for them when she couldn't even listen to their discomfort? How could she preach inclusivity when her actions pointed to the opposite? Rebecca wanted to be the hero, the one who had it all figured out. But now she saw herself as the villain, the one who had undermined everything she had built for the sake of her comfort and ego. Rebecca's decision to block critics had backfired in ways she hadn't anticipated. What began as a tactic to protect her image quickly spiraled into a public relations nightmare. Word spread across social media that Rebecca Knight, the supposed champion of inclusivity, had been silencing dissenting voices, especially from marginalized groups. The very people she claimed to be fighting for were now accusing her of the same exclusion she so vehemently opposed. It didn't take long for the accusations to escalate. Once a trusted figure in the social justice space, Rebecca was now being branded as a hypocrite, accused of silencing the very voices she claimed to amplify. Articles started to pop up on blogs and news sites, each one detailing the growing controversy surrounding her. Headlines like "Social Justice Blogger Blocks Minorities Who Challenge Her" began circulating, further stoking the flames of outrage. The criticism wasn't just online anymore. Media outlets, both mainstream and niche, began to question Rebecca's integrity. The more people spoke out, the clearer it became that the persona Rebecca had carefully curated was crumbling. She had built her entire platform on ideals of inclusivity, but now her actions were coming into direct conflict with her message. Rebecca's social media feed became a battlefield. Followers who had once seen her as a leader in the fight for equality were now divided. Some began questioning their own beliefs. How can we support someone who preaches inclusivity, but blocks the people who need to be heard? One follower tweeted. Another posted, "I can't stand by someone who's afraid of criticism, even when it comes from the people she's supposed to be helping." But not all was lost for Rebecca, at least, not yet. A vocal faction of her followers rallied around her, trying to justify her actions. They argued that the criticisms were a form of cancel culture and that Rebecca had the right to protect her space. "She's only blocking people who are attacking her for no reason," one supporter argued. "She's doing the work, and people just don't understand it." But no matter how much Rebecca tried to defend her actions, the divide was widening. The debate on her platform grew increasingly heated. Proponents of her work began to engage in furious arguments with those calling her out, each side entrenched in their views. The more Rebecca engaged with her supporters, the more the cracks in her brand became evident. The idealistic, unassailable image of Rebecca Knight was fading. The fallout reached its peak when her brand started to suffer. Sponsors, who had once jumped at the chance to partner with her, began to pull away. Their statements were carefully worded: "We support Rebecca's message of inclusivity, but we cannot support actions that undermine it." Her relationships with these sponsors were strained, and lucrative partnerships evaporated. Rebecca watched helplessly as brand deals she had worked for years to secure slipped through her fingers. She had never imagined it would come to this. As if that weren't enough, many of her followers began to look elsewhere, seeking out other activists who seemed more consistent in their messages. Others had turned to influencers with a more authentic and open approach to activism, people who didn't shut down the voices that disagreed with them. In the midst of the chaos, Rebecca could feel her platform losing its grip. The steady stream of support that once flooded her notifications had turned to a trickle, replaced by an overwhelming tide of questions and criticisms. The spotlight that had once felt so powerful now felt suffocating. Rebecca had spent years building her brand, her voice, her influence, her platform. But now, in the wake of this scandal, everything was slipping away. Her carefully constructed image of the progressive, inclusive hero was crumbling, piece by piece. The question now wasn't whether she could fight to regain her reputation, it was whether she could face the truth of her actions and the consequences they had brought. Rebecca sat in her apartment, the glow of her computer screen illuminating her face as she scrolled through the endless streams of backlash. Her followers were no longer just commenting, they were demanding answers. The quiet hum of the city outside did nothing to calm her racing thoughts. For the first time in her life, Rebecca felt a deep sense of unease. The confidence that had once defined her activism, the certainty with which she spoke about justice, seemed fragile and distant now. She was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about herself, about her role in the social justice movement. Had she truly believed in inclusivity? Or had it simply been a tool, a convenient ideology that allowed her to build a platform and gain fame? Rebecca had always prided herself on being a force for change, a loud advocate for the voiceless. But now, with so many people calling her out for silencing those very voices, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. Had she been using inclusivity to further her own brand, to keep herself relevant, to stay on top of the digital heap? Her mind wandered to the times she had justified blocking people, arguing that their criticisms were too harsh or unfair, that they didn't understand the complexity of the work she was doing. But now, faced with the harsh light of accountability, she couldn't help but wonder if she had been dismissing voices that were asking her to be better. Was she truly fighting for justice, or was she merely maintaining the appearance of it to protect her position? The reality of her own biases hit her hard. The people she had blocked, the voices she had muted, had all been calling her to reckon with her privilege, to take a hard look at the ways in which she had failed to live up to her own ideals. Had she been too comfortable in her own echo chamber, too afraid to hear the voices that made her uncomfortable? She had always thought she was the one challenging the status quo, but now she realized she had become part of it, shutting down anyone who didn't fit into her narrative. As Rebecca sat in this sea of self-reflection, a major public event unfolded that would force her to confront her actions head-on. The media erupted with news of a police-involved shooting of a young black man, sparking massive protests across the country. The outrage was palpable, and the stories coming out of the community were heartbreaking. This was the kind of injustice Rebecca had always spoken out against, the very issues she had built her platform to address. But now, as the world around her cried out for justice, Rebecca couldn't help but feel the weight of her own silence. Her feed exploded with posts, statements, and calls for action. People she had once admired were speaking up, standing in solidarity with the victims and the community. But there was a deeper undertone in their words, the acknowledgement that, for too long, their own voices had been silenced in favor of influencers like Rebecca, who had benefited from the fight for justice while avoiding the hard conversations about their own shortcomings. Rebecca watched it all unfold, feeling the sting of her own inaction. She had built a platform by championing the very causes these people were now protesting for, yet here she was, paralyzed, unwilling to step forward and say what needed to be said. This was her moment of reckoning. She was at a crossroads. She could double down, continue to block out the criticism, and refuse to confront her own complicity in the very system she claimed to be fighting. Or she could step forward, admit her mistakes, take accountability for her actions, and show the world that she was willing to evolve. In the quiet of her apartment, with the weight of the world pressing down on her, Rebecca knew the choice was hers. Would she keep up the facade, or would she take the hard road and rebuild her integrity from the ground up? Rebecca sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, caught in a moment of uncertainty. She had thought long and hard about her next move. The weight of everything she had lost, the sponsors, the followers, the public trust, was overwhelming. But even heavier than that was the weight of the choice in front of her. This moment would define her. Would she continue with her platform, ignoring the voices that had so vehemently challenged her, or would she confront the ugly truths she had spent so long avoiding? In the end, Rebecca knew that redemption wouldn't come from pretending nothing had happened. The idea of starting fresh, rebuilding her platform without acknowledging the hurt she'd caused, felt hollow. If she were going to move forward, it had to be with honesty. She owed it to the people who had followed her, supported her, and believed in the cause she had once embodied. With a deep breath, she took the first step. She unblocked every account she had silenced in her attempts to preserve her image. She sat down, read the criticisms again, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly listen. The voices that had called her out weren't attacking her, they were trying to help her see her blind spots. There was no one else to blame but herself for the way things had spiraled. The systemic inequalities she had spoken out against had been present within her own actions all along. Rebecca began the difficult process of acknowledging her mistakes, posting a heartfelt apology to her followers. "I've spent so long trying to maintain a perfect image, fighting for causes I believed in, but I've neglected to listen to the very people I've claimed to advocate for," she wrote. "I've failed you, and I'm sorry. I am committed to learning, to listening, and to doing better. I'll no longer block those who challenge me, I'll engage. I'll take accountability, and I will show up for all of you, even when it's uncomfortable." The backlash was swift. Some people embraced her apology, cautiously hopeful that Rebecca's words would lead to real change. For others, her admission of guilt wasn't enough. They demanded more action, proof that she was genuinely willing to change, not just seeking redemption for her own sake. Her apology wasn't the end of the story, it was only the beginning of the work she had ahead of her. Rebecca began to engage with those she had once silenced. She reached out to Javi, who had started the conversation, and invited him to join her for an open discussion on social media about the complexities of activism. She asked her followers to hold her accountable and make her better. She created spaces on her platform for voices that had long been excluded, giving them the space to speak, to share, to be heard. But the public response remained divided. Some embraced her commitment to change, offering support and guidance as she tried to make amends. Others condemned her, unable or unwilling to forgive her for the damage she had caused. The trust was gone, and for many, it felt like too little, too late. Her platform, once booming, began to lose its influence. Her followers dropped, and the sponsors who had pulled away now stayed away. Despite the mixed reactions, Rebecca felt a shift within herself. She no longer saw her platform as something to protect at all costs. It wasn't about her fame or her image, it was about the work. The real work of justice, which meant being vulnerable, being wrong sometimes, and owning it. In the quiet moments after her apology, Rebecca reflected on the nature of social justice activism. It was one thing to talk about inclusivity, to advocate for the rights of others, to fight against systemic inequalities. But it was another thing entirely to practice it, especially when it meant confronting your own biases, your own privilege, and your own mistakes. She had spent years on the front lines of activism, preaching equality. But it wasn't until she had to face the consequences of her own actions that she truly understood what inclusivity meant. Whether or not Rebecca's platform would ever recover was uncertain. What was certain, though, was that her journey wasn't over. She had come to terms with her own flaws, and now, it was time to work for the change she had always talked about. The fight for justice was never easy, but it was always worth it. And for the first time in a long time, Rebecca was ready to keep fighting.